My wife and I want to welcome you folks to the Washington Graveyard and to the final resting place of our family, the Sheppards. I'm Dennis Scovil Sheppard, and this here's my wife, Mary Jane. We want to tell you about our family, and then we want to tell you about my Civil War career. I was Major Dennis Scovil Sheppard. My great-grandparents came from Ireland. They were born before the Revolutionary War, and they came to the new country on a three-masted schooner. It took 2 months in the ocean. They settled in New Jersey, and that's where my grandpa Dennis was born, and then that's where my dad was born. My dad, Joel, was a cooper. Now, coopers were real important back then. They made wooden barrels, and they needed wooden barrels for most everything from whiskey to molasses. My dad married my mom, Charlotte, in 1828, and they moved way out west to Indiana. There, I was the firstborn in 1829. As soon as my brother Josh was born in 1833, we moved out to the real Wild West here in Washington, Illinois. We were one of the first families to settle in Washington after the founder, William Holland. Let me tell you folks what it was like. Most people lived along the Farm Creek where they had some water and shelter from the timber. The Indians, the Potawatomis, had just been driven out of their villages. The villages still stood there. The Indians roamed around looking for something to eat, and they were unpredictable. The settlers all carried weapons when they did everything. Went to town for provisions, went out to hoe their corn. They took their rifles and left them lay right by the cornfields. Probably my folks thought that was just too rough to raise a family, so it weren't long and they moved back to Elizabethtown, Ohio, where they raised us. By the time I was 19 and my folks had 3 more kids, they moved back out here to Washington. By then it was a little more civilized. Two years later, my mom and pa moved to Canton, Illinois, and left me here. I was 19 years old. By the time I was 21, I was on my own. Now let me tell you a little bit about my ma and finish up telling you about them before we go on with the rest of our family. My ma lived 19 years longer than my pa. She came to live with us after pa died. By the time ma died, she'd buried 5 of her 6 kids. I was the only one left. Back then that weren't unusual because people died pretty young. But my ma had a strong faith in God. And when she died, she was still praising God even though she had lost most of her family.
Dear, let me tell this next part. When Dennis first moved back to Washington, he took up farming. But by 1849, Charles Anthony opened a tinsmith factory. And so my husband took up being a salesman for Mr. Anthony. Lucky for me, he did this because on one of his trips to Menard County, he met my father, Nesbitt Young. And of course, then he soon met me. Why, it wasn't much more than a year later, on December 26, 1850, that we were married.
I never regretted traveling. really liked seeing me come because there weren't many tinsmiths in the area. Plus, I met my helpmate, and we were together for 57 years.
After we were married, we began farming around the Washington area until the war broke out and Dennis enlisted. We abandoned the family farm and moved back to Washington. Well, I moved back to Washington with our 3 children who were ages 3, 7, and 9 years old. Dennis enlisted in the war on October 4th, 1861, Company F, the 11th Illinois Cavalry. And I just want to introduce Alex here, who is dressed as one of the cavalry members would have been dressed. We're fortunate to have him join us today. Dennis enlisted as a private, which is the way he's dressed. He was quickly mustered in as a sergeant, and later, after some of the battles, was made a captain and mustered out as a major. So he was quickly promoted, and Alex has told us that that's because his men, the men in his regiment, probably really respected him. Dennis, so why don't you tell about your experience in the Civil War?
Okay, Ma. I really am proud to have Alex here today because that's how I looked when I was young.
Here is a picture of him in his Civil War uniform, and later, and then the family home. There's another one.
The first year of the Civil War, 1861, was kind of uneventful for me. We had a few skirmishes here and there, but let me tell you about the major battle I was involved with. A battle you folks have probably all heard of. It was called Shiloh. Shiloh had such an impact on me that when I got home in later years, I wrote down almost a whole book and left it with my family so you folks in Washington could hear a lot of what you're hearing today. On the Tennessee River, real near to the Mississippi state line, near Pittsburgh Landing, was Shiloh Church. On the morning of April 6, 1862, General Albert Johnson hurled 40,000 rebel troops in a surprise attack on 36,000 Union troops under General Grant. The first day of the battle didn't go well for the Union. The Union was pushed back to the Tennessee River. In fact, they were right on the border of the river, and the river was very wide, and there weren't no bridge. By nightfall, the rebels figured they were going to have a major victory. We lay there in the rain all night. We didn't have any shelter. We could hear our wounded moaning, but we couldn't go to them in the dark because we didn't know they were Union or whether they were rebels. General Grant didn't seem worried. What he knew was there were two armies double marching to get there by morning. By the next morning, one army of 6,000 and another army of 20,000 got there, and the reinforcements saved the day. It turned out to be a great Union victory. But you know, that's what I felt about the war. We called it a victory. Everybody up north called it a victory, and our Commander-in-Chief, Abraham Lincoln, really needed a victory. But we lost 13,000 men in 2 days. The rebels lost 10,000, but it was considered a Union victory, and Lincoln needed it. At the end of that second day of fighting, I made it back to my tent, and someone had drugged 2 rebel soldiers with broken legs after disarming them and thrown them in my tent, and they were laying there moaning. So I looked outside my tent. There were 2 more soldiers laying outside my tent, and these 2 were dead. One of them was wearing blue, and one of them was wearing gray. My commander said, find out their identification and then take them and bury them. So I had to go through, and I found a pocket Bible in the vest pocket of each of these young men. Each Bible was inscribed by their mother. It said, to my darling son, I hope this keeps you safe and the Lord brings you back home after the war. And I thought while I buried those 2 young men, one 16 years old and one 18, that their ma's weren't going to cry any more than I wept that day when I had to bury those 2 soldiers.
There were so many sad things about the war. It was a terrible war, many loss of lives. But I remember a couple of stories you told me off and on that you could find some humor in a couple of things that happened. One was at the Battle of Shiloh, and you said you were in camp. Sherman's army was on the right, left, and another group on the right, and Grant was 9 miles below the landing. And as the sun rose on Sunday, April 6th of 1862, you went to get a cake of shaving soap. Remember that? And pretty soon you heard a boom from the left, and somebody commented, my goodness, I wonder if they realize it's Sunday. Why are they practicing this early? And then pretty soon you heard another boom on the right, And then you realized that it was more than just a practice. So you hurried off to have the bugle order sound boots and saddles, which is what they did to get everybody mounted. And the interesting part you said you were able to laugh at was that the people trying to saddle their horses would put the saddles on backwards, and after they got on the horses, some of them had forgotten to untie the horses in their hurry to get going. So you were able to sort of laugh a little bit at that. And on top of that, one of the lieutenants came out of his tent rubbing his eyes and saying, "Do you think it's really going to rain?" He thought it was thundering instead of firing. So, and then there was another time you were supposed to capture a ferry boat, and you took one prisoner and got down the river and accomplished your mission for Sherman, and came back and asked him, "What should I do with this prisoner?" Well, his aide, Sherman said, "Well, just do what you think is best with him." But his aide said, "Take him in the bush and shoot him." Well, when you saw that man's face after his aide said that, you, I think, found some sympathy for him. And you did take him in the bush, but then you gave him a meal and said, "Do you think you can find your way home?" Fortunately, he did. She said you had to laugh when you saw how fast he hightailed it out of that bush. Yeah, can you think of anything else about the war that you remember?
The most pleasant memories I have of the war were receiving the letters from my dear wife, Mary Jane. I look forward to those letters, and you know, I had a dream every night before I was going to get a letter, and I was never wrong. One night I even bet my captain, "We're going to get to Richmond tomorrow, and I'll bet there's a letter there from Mary Jane," and I won that wager. Later in life, when I came back and just before I died, I had a dream I was going to meet Mary Jane in a garden. And you know, the next day I did. I died and I met Mary Jane in the garden.
You did. We were one of the lucky ones. My husband Dennis did return to Washington on May of 1865, and we were able to have 3 more children after that. He also engaged in many different businesses in Washington. Traveling salesman, again, was one of those businesses. He was also appointed U.S. Gauger, which means he was in charge of the weights and measures at granaries and different places like that. And he did that in Pekin for 4 years. Then he was appointed postmaster at Washington for 4 years by President Cleveland. He was also supervisor of Washington, which he defeated J.H. Anthony, who held that office for 20-some years. We raised a fairly large family of 6 children, but only 3 did succeed us. Anna Lester, Mrs. H.L. Zinser, and D.S. Sheppard Jr. But we also had 21 grandchildren and 10 great-grandchildren. And Mrs. Anna Lester and her husband are buried here behind us. Dennis gave liberally of his time and energy and talents to the benefit of the community and all of our friends and family. He was of splendid integrity and most loyal as well. He really stood up for his convictions, and everybody sort of looked to Dennis when they came to town and were greeted by him and welcomed by him. Dennis died 7 years after me on June 12, 1950 at age 86, 1815 at age 86. At his daughter Anna Lester's home in Peoria. The funeral service was held there as well. He died peacefully, surrounded by his family after suffering a stroke. The service was officiated by Reverend William Troyer of the Presbyterian Church here in town. And he quoted the following, "I will live for those that love me, for those that know me true, for the heaven that smiles above me, and awaits my spirit too, for the wrongs that need resistance, for the right that needs assistance, for the future in the distance, and the good that I can do." Thank you. Notice there's stone here. There's one with both of them on it, and then the military stone right here to the side, which Alex was telling us is made of limestone, so it does not stand up as well as the granite that the other one is made out of. Yeah, he said this one's standing up pretty well. If you have any questions for any of us, and especially Alex, he does these reenactments quite often too, so he probably knows quite a bit about the military. Hope you enjoy the rest of your walk.